Welcome back, everyone. The topic for our next panel is considerations in transitioning to IP interconnection. To start things off, I would like each of you to briefly introduce yourselves and give us a 30 seconds on what you believe are the key considerations for your organization in transitioning to an all IP interconnection framework. We'll start off with Matt.
I'm Matt Nickols from Verizon. I've been there about 30 years in various different job functions. Most recently, I've been working on TDM elimination and IP interconnects, and I was one of the co-authors of the Allies document, or the agreementless IP interconnect over the internet document. And I'm going to say, what are we interested in as Verizon as a company? And I think this goes to what I just said about Allies. It's very intentional that we call that document Allies, because we believe everybody has an interest to get off of TDM. It's decaying. We got to get rid of it. We got to get moved to IP. So that's our number one interest, is getting off the TDM network.
Thanks, Matt. Brighid?
Hello, I'm Brighid Riordan. I am the CEO of Nsight, and under that name, we have companies from ILEX to CLEX to also mobile network operations. And we've been in business for 116 years. We started with providing regular POTS to a Polish immigrant village in Wisconsin. And the biggest controversy was when my great-grandparents got involved because they were Irish. So we've done a little bit of everything, and I'm very excited to be here to share perspectives from a small carrier as we talk about this topic.
Thanks, Brighid. Jody?
My name's Jody Kalt. I'm a voice engineer with SDN Communications in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. Hoping to provide a little bit, maybe unique perspective, a little bit, or insight. SDN is ultimately owned by 17 rural telcos in Sioux Falls. We have roughly a 50,000-mile fiber backbone that we've installed and maintained as well. And also, among our membership and us, reach about 90% of the state of South Dakota. So a large majority of that. As we discuss the transition to IP, I look forward to focusing on preserving voice quality, network reliability, rural call completion, and accountability across the end-to-end call path. The move to all IP interconnection is here and necessary, but we still lack a clearly defined framework to replace the one that supports these outcomes today. Simply put, before we tear down the old bridge, we need to make sure the new one is fully built, tested, and ready to carry the load. That will reduce uncertainty, avoid unintended service impacts, and ultimately accelerate the transition to all IP. I look forward to talking more with all of you.
Thanks, Jody. Jason?
Yes, good morning, everyone. Jason Campbell, CEO of FirstLight. We are a CLEC, competitive exchange provider, focused in the Northeast. I personally have been in this business for about 30 years and a number of environments and entities. And as Matt just mentioned, I think he's right on the transition away from TDM to IP. But I'm here today to ensure we don't conflate topics and actually accidentally reduce the size of the internet, reduce choice, remove bandwidth options from customers, and generally shrink the internet and make it a lower quality, worse environment because we put too many components in this initiative.
Thanks, Jason. Hany?
Good morning. Hany, Fahmy with AT&T. I have been with AT&T for 28 years, 17 of those in AT&T labs through different functions. Started with DSL, and when it was ATM based, went to mobility, and right now with global public policy. I am looking forward to help the team here. First of all, I handle all kind of technology policy issues and specifically focused on IP transition and wireline transformation. And I'm here actually to help the team here to gain insights of how interconnection, the state of the industry when it comes to IP interconnection. I heard lots of good thoughts and arguments in the previous panel, and I'm hoping that by the end of this panel, you will gain some insights of what's happening out there what's happening out there today. Because believe it or not, 75 to 80% of the voice traffic of the United States is actually running over IP interconnection today. And there is a very significant amount of this voice traffic going over the internet today. And there is all the smaller providers are using IP, voice or IP today. And we are here to talk about the remaining 10 or 15%. So I am trying to focus our view on the remaining 10 and 15%. How can we safely migrate this? We already migrated the 75 to 80%. So we are here to talk about the remaining.
Thanks so much. And when we spoke last Friday, most of you indicated that you see ongoing challenges to transitioning to IP interconnection as the most important issue. And starting with you, Hany, keying off what you just said, what do you see as the primary stumbling blocks, and how would you classify them in terms of who they applied to? Is it the carriers, the regulators, service organizations, the actual technologies?
Yeah, absolutely. I very much appreciate the question. And so I'm sorry to reiterate this, but again, if you look at the majority of voice traffic today, at least between the wireless providers, the major wireless providers, major cable providers, and even CVoIP providers, this traffic is actually carried over IP interconnection today. And one thing I just want to make sure is clear. The internet is not the only option for IP interconnection. There is plethora of IP interconnection options out there. There is VPN, there is direct IP connectivity, and there is the internet. All these are available options today. If any carrier is not comfortable with the internet, they can actually use other mechanisms. They can use VPNs. In terms of reliability as well, we are interconnected in multiple places to different carriers. And different connections, different resilient connections, reliable connections can be provisioned, and it doesn't have to be the internet. So it depends on the degree of comfort. What are the issues that we see, going back to the question, what are the issues we see for IP interconnection? First of all, the first one, 251C, 215, are for TDM interconnection. It is not economical or technically feasible for IP interconnection. We do not have to, for IP interconnection, for VoIP, we do not have to interconnect in every ladder. We do not have to use the existing framework for co-location. There are so many other options for interconnectivity that is available for carriers today, have been pursued for a very long time for internet traffic and for IP connectivity. So we do not have to use the 251C or the 251C 215 or 216 for interconnection. Don't get me wrong, I'm not here to tell you that it's all rosy on IP interconnection. There are some issues with IP interconnection. Some of these agreements take time. And there are some interoperability issues. For example, fax. Carrying fax traffic for IP interconnection, there has been a challenge when it comes to interoperability. It works, but there are some challenges about that needs to be addressed. There is a significant shortage of subject matter experts on this topic. So we are throwing lots of resources on it, but on the other hand, this cannot be just an AT&T function. We have to have subject matter experts across the board, across the whole industry, to be able to do IP interconnection successfully. And finally, there are some security considerations that needs to be taken into account. For example, distribution of certificates are things that we need to take into consideration. There is no established framework for that. But all these issues, if you think about video, for example, 10 years ago, if somebody come and tell you that video is going to be carried over Wi-Fi, I personally, as a technologist, I would have laughed at them. And believe it or not, today, Wi-Fi is carrying significant amount of video traffic. All these things can be worked and it requires a commitment from the whole industry, not only AT&T.
Jason?
Thank you. Very well said. I think you're right. Security, some interop. I think Harold mentioned it in the last one. What's an outage? Right. There's a different definition of that for IP, but probably to help ground the entire workshop, whether it's Wi-Fi, wireless, or whatever, all these IP transport things come back to fiber, right? So I feel like we may be conflating fiber optic connections. IP is not a soft cloud. It routes over fiber. Fiber generally manifests itself in the central area of the CO. So the CO is really the on and off road for IP and fiber connectivity. That is what wireless towers use. Many wireless towers come back to COs. Wi-Fi generally probably comes back to a fiber connection in a CO. We've somehow conflated co-location and IP interconnect in here. So I feel like the biggest risk is the elimination of C6 or forbearance around C6, because that would literally eliminate the ability for hundreds of thousands, millions of end users. I'd even say hundreds of millions of users go through the COs every day on fiber, whether it's wireless backhaul, education, businesses, et cetera, we need to decouple that and remove this potential forbearance of C6 because it doesn't make sense. You're actually going to reduce the number of providers greatly across the entire ecosystem.
Jody?
So some of the ongoing challenges that I've seen or we've seen, as both of you guys mentioned, workforce is one. Obviously, you magnify that in a rural community, it's even more exponential. Probably just as important with that is ultimately, what is the default framework? Today, we do have a default framework. That's how everything works. Not suggesting one bit that we carbon copy over the framework by any means, but I don't want us to lose track of the lessons learned to get to this point. Everybody that's been involved in this industry has dealt with issues at one point or another, and we make things better. We want to do best by our customers, provide the best service we can, but those can't be lost. The roles and responsibilities, that's one thing that I think is critical in our industry, that we all work together, I believe, in a common mission, but we also have to hold each other accountable because that's what makes a great network great. And then also, as you mentioned, there's, from an IP interconnect perspective, I don't think SIP per se, and try not to get too technical in this, even though as mentioned, this was a nerd out forum earlier, but I don't believe that is necessarily the underlying issue. Voice over IP or SIP has been around for a while. It's matured. There's a lot of places that use it. We can pull statistics and calls on that, but it's ultimately dependent on that underlying Ethernet or IP connection. An old adage, you're only as strong as your weakest link, is true here. And over the public internet, can it work? It can. We've tested that. But should that be our default option? Our failback, our failsafe? That's really the question of the quality of service that we're looking at replacing today, that's in our network where we've gone through the trials and tribulations to get to this point. So those are some of the concerns. With elaborate, and then I'll finish up a little bit. Some of the more specific concerns really, I guess, true to the IP interconnection. One concern is the IP interconnections, going back to the roles and responsibilities, is there's IP interconnections out there, but it's not from a bigger or holistic level related to the PSTN. There's onesie twosies. We can exchange this traffic here. We can exchange that traffic here. But how about the traffic that's not just going between those two providers? So there's a bigger, higher level look at this that really needs to get to that foundation. I think that's ultimately what we're trying to discuss too.
Brighid?
For the record, I don't think I'm one of the nerds. So my perspective is we continue to be an independent company because we don't think that anyone else can care for our customers and our communities as well as we can. That is our premise. Love is literally the driver for what we do. An example for this, for Chairman Carr's wallet, is that we actually zero bid through BEAD to win zero money so that we can overbuild fiber in our original ILECs. We're not taking money from the government because we think we can take care of it better than anybody else. So my perspective is that in these IP interconnects, that we get lost. And there's a history of that we get lost among the big carrier priorities. So that the stumbling blocks that we're looking at are, even when we have 14 tandems that we connect through, and even when we're bringing IP traffic, the tandems are not set up to accept it. So we have to purchase a connection so that it can be translated, and then it's translated to TDM from IP. And so we're having to buy these, for example, these DS3 circuits, and everybody knows what a DS3 circuit costs. 2021, for example, we had one that was $300 a month. That's a reasonable cost. When the unbundling occurred and rate regulation was no longer involved, the prices went up. And if you refer to this as the market setting the prices, this is not a market I've ever been in before, because our prices have increased 5,000% in 3 years. So now that $300 per month circuit costs $46,000 per month. So to me, that's a canary in the coal mine of what happens when there's not oversight by the FCC. It's a little bit Wild West. And so that's one example. So we've had to work through third parties, which takes our customers further away from us, further away from being able to make sure that there's quality of service, etc. Additionally, our customers and those customers that go through those tandems don't benefit from stir shaken because it doesn't work through TDM connections. So while we've transitioned to IP and our customers are on IP, they don't get the benefits of stir shaken because the tandems have not been updated to current technology. And I think the other thing that we look at too is we have some co-locations, of course, having been in business for this long. I do agree as well that it's about traffic routing. It's not as simple as a connection. But we've asked to co-locate at a new tandem where we expanded service to, and we were told we were not allowed. And I think that has to do with the unbundling as well. So then where do we go? We don't have options. What we've had to do in this stumbling block to try to curtail these costs, because I have 10,000 subscribers in our ILECs. A $46,000 circuit for one of those per month it's just not economically feasible. So we've had to work through a third-party provider who will then take the traffic and convert it to TDM. Sorry, allergies. And then route it. And I think that's a short-term solution, but we don't see that as long-term. We think that the pricing will go up and be passed through them. And also just takes us further away from our customer. So those are my primary concerns that we're seeing.
Thanks, Bridget. And Matt?
All right, I'm going to cycle a little bit back to what Hany was talking about. I want to look at some notes here because I want to be very specific with some terminology. So like Hany was saying, the vast majority of traffic, and when we're talking about this, we're talking about minutes of use. The vast majority of minutes of use have shifted to IP interconnects already. And there's two primary methods for that. One, what I'm just going to call a negotiated bidirectional interconnects for on-net traffic via VPNs or virtual private networks. What do I mean about on-net? It's what Jody said. It's an agreement between two carriers to exchange their traffic and their traffic only. It's not to exchange stuff coming through an access tandem from some other carrier and making something that works for everybody. This is a one-on-one agreement, and that's the way these things are currently handled today. They're on-net traffic only. So the VPN's the big one, and that's used for really big carriers, big interconnects where we need the highway. I think that was mentioned earlier, where the highway is needed. It's not an issue of quality or anything like that. It's just an issue of volume. The second one is we learned from that experience and we said, hey, there's other people that can't buy or can't justify that interconnect. So we need something more granular, something easier. And that's where the internet came into play. And we said, okay, Same thing, one-on-one negotiated bidirectional interconnects for on-net traffic use, but now we're talking IPsec or TLS for the signaling over the public internet. So that's really the second option, and that's coming more into play now. That's where we're getting some more traffic. And so what you can see here is maybe the first one took 70% of the traffic, the next one's going to pick up another 20% of traffic, but we then end up with this tail-end problem. How do you get that last 10%, last 20%, whatever it may be? We organically did this in the industry. This wasn't based on regulations. We skimmed off the top. We looked at the networks and we said that we can be more efficient here. We can use these private agreements and do these things. But now we need to get the rest. And that's where this really gets hard. So now that we're facing that problem, we really had to come up with a new idea as to how we make that happen and how we do it in a few years, not decades. So I'll come back to the end, and I'm going to go a little long here, sorry, but this is the main one I want to get through on. You ask, what are the problems we see specifically? And there's two big ones that we have right now. One, intercarrier compensation. It's incentives to keep TDM interconnects. There's people that do not want to move to IP interconnects simply because they can collect revenue on these TDM interconnects based on the current regulations. So that's number one. And that's both the per minute charge and the facilities charge, right? The DS3 that went up 5,000%. That is a huge cost in those situations, but some are incented to keep those TDM interconnects so they can continue to receive that revenue or that compensation. The second thing is some regulated services that are still an extra burden. And the one I'm going to highlight is equal access. So equal access is where, as a user of one network, you pick a primary interexchange carrier or PIC that then routes you to a particular long distance carrier. Believe it or not, that still exists today. Your cell phone, maybe not, okay? You don't get to choose who your long distance carrier is on your cell phone. But on a lot of the regulated old services, we still have that as a big problem. And also 10-1 kick dial around services. So that would be the other thing. Those two things are things that the FCC could help us with to say, one, intercarrier compensation. You're already in the process. You're already pushing that forward. That's great because that is an incentive for some people to stay on TDM interconnects. And then the whole issue of equal access, it really just needs to be gone. It's not required to be provided anymore, if I understand correctly, but it's grandfathered. So any existing lines we already have, we got to keep on honoring those. And why that's a problem is if I can take a whole block of numbers and just say, you know what, if I have an IP interconnect, I route it that way and I'm done with it. But as long as I still have to honor that long distance carrier PIC, then I got to send it somewhere else. And it's really hard to then, how do I siphon that traffic off and how do I make that happen? And yes, we can move all those customers from those regulated old services to new VoIP services, but that takes time and we can't just do that. We're not just allowed to slam them over from old service to new. We still have to honor those old services. So taking away some of that would also help as well. So there's some other nuanced things that maybe we could get into later. Probably not going to have time, so I'll skip through those. But this one-on-one negotiated interconnects is where it's really not viable to get to 100%, right? The way we're going right now with the VPN, with the IPsec connections on a one-on-one agreement, it's just not viable to get 1,500 plus carriers all directly interconnected. And it was mentioned earlier, that's 1 million interconnects if we were to do that. And that's just if you have one interconnect between each other. You probably have geographic reasons to have 2, 3, 4. You also have other reasons for redundancy. So you're talking millions upon millions. It's a spider web of interconnects that are required. And so when we looked at that problem and we said, we cannot get to the deadline that's proposed with the current model. We need something new. And that's why the industry came up and said, we need this allies agreement, this agreementless IP interconnect using the internet. And that's what we proposed. And so if you haven't already looked at or don't know the details there, I would actually encourage you to go to the Branded Calling Summit 2026 webpage, and you can go there. It already happened, but they recorded it. But if you log in, it allows you to get the recorded sessions. And myself, Martin Dolly, Phil is in the room here. I forgot where he went, but you're straight in front of me. Good grief. That's the way you get when you get old and you wear your glasses. All did this presentation. It explains what that is, how it would work. And we do think that's the way for the industry to drive forward to get everybody interconnected directly, which then eliminates this hierarchy system that we've had traditionally.
Thank you.
Thanks, Matt. So, keying off of what you just said there, Bridget, how do you think the concerns that you expressed might be addressed by this agreementless interconnection over the internet? What kinds of safeguards would need to be in place? Would we need to adopt certain technical standards, quality of service standards, prioritization requirements? And do you think that could overcome the issues that your customers are facing now?
Yes. But I think the key is it has to be guided by the FCC. I think we just want to make sure that the safeguards, the reliability, the security, the accuracy of the routing is maintained. And I don't know a lot about the Allied that you're referring to, but we all want to get to IP. What I'm saying is we're asking for that modernization, but I'm concerned that without oversight, we will look at being deprioritized. Already, if you've ever tried to get a hold of a large ILEC, it's a challenge to be heard when there's issues. So I think it's just a matter of intentionally really making sure that no one is left behind, essentially. And there was a little bit of talk about the call completion issues earlier, and that it had to do with rates. And that's fine if that's what it was. But the point is that it was a choice by those large carriers to not complete calls to rural carriers. So my whole thing is, let's put the technical standards in place. Let's make sure that this is seamless. Let's make sure that Joe can talk to his grandmother wherever she is and not go backwards in making sure that all Americans can connect with each other. And that's what I'm afraid of. And what I've seen, to me, shows examples of that already starting to happen, even though the tandems are regulated currently. So my view is really just that carefully, systemically making sure that all carriers, all grandparents are connected the way they need to be and not dropped. I have another peer that had a situation where their tandem connections were just dropped and no grandmothers could call anybody because they were just connected and disconnected, forgotten about. And so those are the kind of things that we see on the streets of Southwest Green Bay. And that's just what I want to bring forward, is that when we do it mindfully, purposefully, test it, and make sure that we're all doing this together.
Jody, have you seen some of the same issues or different issues?
One of the issues concerned about or curious a little bit, and it was mentioned on the previous panel as well, and I mentioned earlier, ultimately, voice quality over IP is dependent on the underlying transport mechanism. It needs consistent data. It's real-time communication. So it's different data than just going to view a web page. If there's delay and latency, it might not load as quick or whatever the case is. No big interruptions. Voice quality, you're going to hear the delay, the breakup, the jitter, whatever the case is. And so going back to what I said earlier, really feel that needing a default framework with clearly outlined roles and responsibilities. Again, it doesn't need to be something heavy-handed, but it needs to be a default backstop. And I don't say that with a negative connotation because it's really a starting point for negotiations. Because what I've also seen too is negotiations start and they start and they still start. But at what point is there's no backstop of a decision, so to speak, to work on? And so that's really one big underlying problem. But without those safeguards in place too, you need to know the reliability. And as I mentioned, over the internet, can it work? Yes. But when we engineer something, last panel touched on it a little bit too, diversity. Whether we're talking a regular phone call, calling a family member, whatever the case is, or it's an emergency call, those calls are important, but we don't design a network or an infrastructure for how it's working right at this moment under normal conditions. A default framework really has to take into account how are we going to replace the quality, not the protocol, not the technology, but how are we going to replace the quality and the universal service across the country to take advantages of the advancements and the flexibility that SIP and IP interconnection has to offer. One thing also to push on the concern over the public internet, and again, I'm not saying it's not an option by any means, you as a fail-safe or backup. Because if we're all being honest, a private or dedicated connection isn't fail-safe either. Fiber cuts happen, unexpected things. In rural South Dakota, there's gophers. And I don't know how the heck they find those, because fiber optic cables aren't that big, but they find them. So that redundancy we talk about has to be taken into account, but we also have to be aware of the risks and uncertainty that can present itself when we look at that. On top of that, one issue, and I've experienced it personally, is when a call goes over the public internet, and I'll just give a random hypothetical, ideal conditions, there's no delay per se or congestion, whatever the case is, but who's responsible? And that's one of the underlying, from an operational standpoint or on the engineering side that I deal with frequently, we're having call quality. Okay, well, where's it going? Okay, it's going down this connection. You talk to that carrier, they can see it hop by hop. If that call's set out over the public internet and that's the only option or that's the default option, the public internet is just exactly what that is. It's publicly accessible networks that work together. But that path that path by design is dynamic. Well, in voice, that can cause some major issues too.
And Hany, it looked like you were trying to weigh in.
Yeah, I am. First of all, I don't want Bridget to pay the $46,000. Okay, and we don't want Jason to go collocate in every one of the 200 datas out there. Definitely don't. And that's why the whole industry needs to move away from the TDM network and TDM framework. So I think we are on violent agreement here. I want to address a couple of things. First of all, the AT&T, when we started looking at internet, and we have carriers that are interconnected with us today over the internet. And when I say interconnected, means a session border controller or a VoIP core network connected to a VoIP core network with an interconnection. I'm not talking about drop or access to customers. I'm talking about interconnection. We started looking at that, and we were concerned about the quality of service and the performance. So we actually went and tested the performance of interconnection over the internet. And there are 2 expertise that we filed about this that has information about this, public information. You can go look at it. And we compared the performance of voice calls going over the public internet with voice calls that are going over the dedicated VPN connections that Matt talked about, that the highways are carrying the connection between wireless carriers. And believe it or not, it's comparable. Performance, latency, packet loss, and call drops and call blocked, all compared. This is public information. You can go look at it. So I understand there is a fear in the industry about this, but on the other hand, you need to understand that the bandwidth needed, the U.S. made a very significant investment on internet and internet capacity. And the bandwidth needed for the remaining 10 or 15% of the voice that remains back on TDM is very small. And believe it or not, the internet is highly redundant, highly mesh connected today. Even more redundant and more resilient than the TDM network today. Okay? And we tested this export A. Some people said, oh, this is dedicated AT&T connection on both sides. Absolutely not. These interconnections happened over the internet, crossing peering points. So if you go look at the utilization of peering points across the country, they are not anywhere close to what you think they are. They are in the low 20s in terms of utilization under normal operations. Now you have an election day, or you have a disaster somewhere in the world. That's a different story. But in the normal operations, 360 days, probably a year, there is a huge mesh of highways available over the internet that, and I'm not talking drop to the customers, I'm talking interconnection between carriers. And again, if any carrier is concerned about this, you do not have to use the internet model. The internet model is a quick default model for Brighid not to pay the $46,000 or Jason to collocate in every single area for the remaining percentage. And Brighid do not have to convert TDM voice to IP or IP voice to TDM. One important thing, and I'm sorry going long here, one important thing here, we all move to an IP model, even smaller carriers. They take the traffic from the customer as IP. And they take this to a cloud-based soft switch providers. And we do not have to convert this back to TDM and go back to the tandem. We do not. And this is why we are proposing a model that can help all of us here.
So I want to just pick up on one thing Hany said that maybe got a little lost in that little translation. The internet is resilient. TDM interconnect points is usually one, maybe two interconnects to the switch and maybe diverse fiber, but the gopher can bite it and somebody else can be on maintenance and all of a sudden you have an outage for days. Or private agreements, IP VPN interconnects, those are also limited. It's only the public internet that gives you self-healing resiliency that will avoid some of these major outages that can happen. It just takes care of itself because there's so many diverse paths that can help. That's all I wanted to add.
Thank you, and that's not wrong. I just want to clarify one point about my world, just to make sure we're not talking past each other. So we are a CLEC, and I probably represent many CLECs. And the colo facilities for us, they represent the physical central point where all the fiber in that community terminates. So I actually have to be co-located there and have to have a presence there because all the fiber capacity, like all the high bandwidth that goes to any enterprise, fiber to the home, wireless towers, all those things, it is there. I have to be there for those reasons. So I want to be in those, right? As the environment changed, right? You've got prior to the 96 Act, you had basically investment guaranteed returns. We built this entire environment of pole lines and CO. The CO is the centralized manifestation of the telecom network. I need to be there to have access. That is how people get high bandwidth. That is how people get high speed. That is how people get choices. That's my position. I can't have that taken away.
So absolutely, makes sense. And believe it or not, what drove this, and keep me honest here, what drove this is actually 251c6. Okay? And if you have done this already, believe it or not, there are IP and internet connections in the CO that you are co-located in. Most of these COs have IP connectivity, regardless if you choose the internet or you choose VPN or you choose direct connections, it sits in the CO where you're co-located in. The point I'm trying to make is the new model does not have to drive you to co-location.
100%. I own the fiber in those COs.
Yeah.
It's my last mile to connect to everyone.
Absolutely.
I agree with you. From a TDM connection in the CO, we don't need it. I agree. Completely agree. We need the presence in the CO.
So if you look very quickly on how the modern era architecture for VoIP, it is carrying the traffic from the customer over an IP connection, and most time internet, going to cloud-based soft switch providers, and those normally act as an aggregator for many providers. None of that touches co-location points. None of that require 251c6. None. So the new era VoIP that is carrying most of the traffic in the US, none of it require the 251c and the must co-location Now, if you've done the co-location, believe it or not, IP connection sits right there. You can use it, you can leverage it, you can connect with any of the major carriers around the internet and around the country, and their session controllers via this IP connection.
So something that's come up repeatedly is this idea of voice over the internet. And I guess I want us to zero in on what do we mean by that? Are we talking about over the internet with some sort of like technical standard scaffolding that ensures prioritization, that ensures quality of service? What does this look like exactly from each of your perspectives?
I don't know, Matt.
You want me to jump in this time? Okay. So in my mind, you got to remember why this proposal came into place. We've had the experience of building VPN interconnects for really big, large volume things, justifiable. And by justifiable, I'm not just talking cost. Contact person, negotiate the contract, make the technical agreements, get the circuits, pay for those circuits, make the interconnects, test, turn up. That is a lengthy process, very difficult. Using IPsec and doing what we call small carrier interconnect, because it's not the large volume, it's the smaller volume, that's over the internet, because we're trying to say we recognize this is a tremendous burden if we're trying to do lots and lots of connections. And so that moves us naturally to the internet. Now, to take advantage of the internet, you can't go make new rules. The internet's not going to change for us. It's not going to magically say, oh yeah, I'm going to give prioritization to all your voice traffic. No, the internet is what it is. It's best effort. We acknowledge that. But it's huge. And we're not talking about access. We're talking about core network, interconnects between carriers. You're on the backbone of the internet at that point. And in many cases, it's your internet to the other internet providers at a tier 1 level. If not a tier 1 level, maybe tier 2. But you're in the core of the network. And if we've got problems with capacity, dropping packets and stuff like that in the core, then quite frankly, people need to spend more money and beef up that part of the network. So to me, the quality issue is a little misled, because that kind of concept comes more from an access. If I'm in my home Wi-Fi, yeah, if you're watching 3 video streams in your home network, every room in the house, you got multiple kids, and then you try to make your voice call over that, yeah, you're going to have problems because you've exhausted your local capacity. But that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the core. And we've got lots of services that have run over this for years. This is not a new thing. We have wholesale carriers who are interconnected through the public internet. We got retail customers. We got interconnects, like Hany explained, that between other carriers specifically for this reason. So it works. We can have a debate over quality and all that stuff as long as we want, but it is proven to work by those customers that are using it.
So I just want to, what we are talking about here, and this came up on the previous panel as well, lack of standards, this term. The connections that we have over the internet today is point-to-point connections between session controllers, and it's using user in TLS. Some carriers go unencrypted. Sometimes they use TLS, sometimes they use IPsec. And there is an ATA standard for that. It's 1100 that recommends exactly how to do this. So there's no lack of standard for this simplistic model that is being used across this. There's no lack of standards on it. The standard is available and it is existing. We are interconnected today using these models, one of these 3 models that is in 1100.
Jody?
So going back to what I've mentioned previously too, you're only as good as your strongest weakness, whether that's private line connection, dedicated public internet, but in essence, in its name, public, it does good for what it's used for. Can it route voice calls? It can. But where do the rules and responsibilities lie is the problem within the framework, the guiding structure. Going back to, I think it was first question or maybe opening statement, learning from our past, not to carry that into the future. And you can't compare the public internet to a private line connection that has the ability for QoS monitoring, dedicated roles and responsibilities, a point of interconnection that's identified so you know where one role starts, one role stops. Because at the end of the day, like I also mentioned earlier, you don't engineer something like this for best case scenario. It's for when a situation comes up or an issue arises. What's the first thing from a troubleshooting perspective to try to correct the problem? You need to identify the problem and locate it. But what if you don't know who to call or where that call has gone through to get to the other end? So those are the problems. Today, and with private connections, I know there's a contract. It could be an SLA, whatever the case is, but I know who to contact. Again, it's only as good as that underlying mechanism. To Matt's point too, I completely agree with you. From a contractor negotiation standpoint, one-on-one negotiations is not scalable at a high level. It is. I think anybody would be remiss to agree to that. And that's why with NTCA's model, I think is something very important to look at, and maybe a little biased, but if we look at in my opening remarks, when I mentioned might have a unique perspective, there's only 3 centralized access tandems in the country. We happen to be one of them. What's that centralized equal access tandem do? It aggregates traffic. We also have a fiber backbone, a regional fiber backbone. But what does that provide not only for our subtending LECs, but also additional carriers? One connection point to be able to reach many. And it makes a transition a lot easier. But we have to still have those rules of the road. We have to have a detailed framework that is enforceable for when situations do arise. Again, whether it's legislation or troubleshooting something, it's for the what ifs when they arise.
Do you think that any of the points that have been raised would address your specific concerns, whether it's the best efforts over the internet or technical framework that we impose to ensure correct routing or multiple interconnection aggregation points? I'd like to get your perspective from a small carrier.
I think a lot of these options can work. We successfully do this with our wireless traffic, right? Wireless to wireless. And there are carrier hotels in Chicago and Minneapolis, and that works very well. And so something like that, I think replicated would work well. I think Hamy's talked about standards. I just want to make sure that those standards are enforced standards and not voluntary. Because I think when they're voluntary, you get a mishmash, and again, I use the word deprioritization. Smaller carriers get deprioritized. I don't know if it solves every problem. While there still are copper landlines, I think it can't all quite transition as fast as we'd want it to. And so I think that's part of what there was a little bit of cart before the horse here, I think, as far as unis and copper lines. And okay, that's fine, but the IP interconnect was a little bit disregarded, which is why we have this Wild West. So I think bottom line is I think we can make an IP situation work for sure, but we have to standardize that. And I just don't see voluntary decisions working.
So, insofar as the FCC's role in all of this, do you envision the commission, whether it be like the ATA standards or whatever it may be, specifying these things? Do we leave it to industry? To what extent do we play a role in encouraging the adoption of these various standards?
If I can take that, I agree with what everyone's termed as light touch, but I think if the FCC doesn't specify, when you look at rural call completion back in 2013, we'd already been dealing with that for years. it didn't get resolved until the FCC stepped in and said, you have to complete these calls to rural America. We said you have to, and you do have to, until about 2017. I would look to that one to say, I think someone talked about learning from things that have happened in the past. We had to bang on a lot of drums to even bring that to people's attention in 2013. And again, it took, 4 years? So I think the FCC has to have a hand in specifying standards and what we will do and we need to do it. We have to do it.
Are there steps that the commission could take to encourage IP interconnection at this point?
Sorry. One of the things the example that we look to is the POIs that were created for EZNet and G911. To me, there's a framework there. I don't know that solves all the issues, but for us, that would certainly be doable. And I think it's a platform that is ready to be taken to another step with tandems. Matt?
Yeah, so the way I view it, the two issues I mentioned before, inter-carrier compensation, bringing that down so there's no longer incentive to not move to IP, and equal access, making it easier for something that already exists to also move over to that. But beyond that, I think the key thing is let the industry work on this. The Allies Agreement is already in the ATA-SIP Forum IP&I Task Force working group. We're trying to move that forward. And that's really a change in the mindset because it's taking that view of we went and did a one-on-one agreement. Sorry, rest of you don't get to be a part of that. We didn't help you, we helped ourselves. We skimmed off the top. And then I came to you and did the same thing. But what we really need to get to now is the TDM access tandem world is the default today. IP is skimming off the top. We need to get to a point where both are 100% covered. Nobody's missing a call. Nobody can't be interconnected, but both have to happen. And then TDM can start turning down. So we need to get that transition of TDM's the backstop right now. Eventually it needs to go away because it is decaying. And I don't think anybody's going to argue that. The vendor support's going away, all the infrastructure going away. It's extremely costly to maintain all those TDM interconnects, but we need to get that transition. And so the FCC helps by taking away some of those things that are burdens today, let the industry move through the standards process to try to get this new concept that allows more focus on direct interconnectivity between everybody as an option.
Speaking about taking FCC requirements away, this is more for Jason. You expressed concern about elimination of the co-location obligation. Do you think that if that obligation were to be taken away, that would lead to providers such as yourself being kicked out of these central offices? Do you think the central offices would be decommissioned?
I think there's a lot of risk, and I think we've conflated core with access. You hear Matt and Hany talk about core. IP transition is a core item. We've conflated and put access in it, which is the co-location piece. Matt, you're right. If you move to a core, the TDM interconnects and the colos go away anyways. So we don't need to try to remove 251c6 because it's an access related item. And Bridget, your experience with like TDM pricing going up from $200 to $300 a month to $50,000 or $60,000 a month for T1s or even DS3s, anything like that. If you take the obligation away, we've seen it with TDM circuits, what that could exactly happen in the colos as well. And that would effectively either push all your CLECs out of the colos due to cost, or they could get shut down. There'd be no access to the last mile fiber, right? IP starts at fiber. That fiber is in either a tower or in someone's business or home. If you remove that co-location, you'll remove much of the fiber that America uses to connect to the internet. Again, we've got to take the access piece out of this completely to maintain the services that we're all used to and accustomed to. I think generally I'm hearing the same thing.
So 251c6 was done for the purpose of voice connectivity. It was not done to bring in traffic. And Jason, I'm just brainstorming here. Was done for the purpose of voice connectivity to the tandem. It was not done for the purpose of bringing in customer access on fiber to a co-location space.
And we're aligned because I think over time, CLECs eventually do not need the TDM interconnect.
So the main purpose that it was done for is not there anymore. You do not need this for VoIP. You do not. If you do not, you just can IP interconnect. If you do not trust the internet, you can be IP interconnect. You do not have to be co-located from wherever you are. You can IP interconnect to other carriers without going to a colo space. And most of the time, it is not LATA bound. It is in a carrier hotel, as Brighid said. So 251c, the main purpose it was created for does not make sense for VoIP connectivity anymore. That is the topic of this discussion. Access is a different story. And bringing traffic from customers to a co-location space, that's a different story. One other thing I just want to say, you asked the previous question and Matt rightly responded that the FCC actually might have an essential role on the IP interconnection moving forward. The ALI model that the industry is working on actually requires maintaining certificate model for access. So if you have agreementless access, you want to access Verizon or you access AT&T or Comcast, you need a certificate. You need to be identified from a security perspective. And who's going to maintain this certificate model? Something very similar to what was done for Star Shaken. So the FCC might play an important role in coordinating this certificate authorization model moving forward. And this is what will help bring in or take out the rest 10 or 15% from the TDM network into IP. And we just, all of us, Brighid does not have to pay the $46,000. You don't have to be co-located in every LATA. You have to be interconnected to a tandem, which has been obsolete for the past 20 years. You don't have to do all of that. And we save ourselves the hassle of dealing with the TDM network year after year.
We're just about running out of time. I know Jody and Brighid, you both want to say something. We do need to keep it a little bit quick because everyone's going to have to get back through security to get to come back for the afternoon panels. So if we keep it really fast.
Will do. So I think, again, I agree with what Matt said last time, but I think it also proves the point that we need a default framework to operate within. We can't just have, say, a Wild West. We cannot replicate or bring forward issues we've had in the past. Otherwise, we don't need any rules or regulations. They won't exist. Again, I said this earlier, we don't need a heavy-handed, but we do need something that is clearly defined, but that still allows flexibility because there are a lot of situations out there to do a one-off, to whatever the case is, that default framework, we can do something better than that. And that's the whole intent to it. It's to encourage that, but without a default framework, it raises questions. Where does responsibility start? Where does responsibility lie? And that's one of the big issues with others out there with conversion to IP is because they don't want to be on the wrong side of anything, but there just needs to be some clarity behind that.
And I just want to respond to Hany as well, that I think that between your vision and where we are now is my concern. And I know you don't want me to pay $46,000 a month for one circuit, and you may or may not be charging me that now from your company. But I don't have any other options. I need to get this traffic switched. So